let's go ahead and get started then. So thank you all for joining us today for What's Up with American Religion. Please forgive the title, it's as creative as we could make it. Brought to you by Christians in Political Science. I am Daniel Bennett, Associate Professor of Political Science at John Brown University here in stormy and newly dampened Northwest Arkansas after the drought we've been in. I'm also the outgoing president of Christians in Political Science. I've been in that role since 2018, and it's time to move on. CPS is a network of Christian political science faculty, grad students, those who support them, whose members work at small Christian colleges, large research universities, and really everywhere in between. Today's webinar focuses on an important and ever-present question: what is happening in American religion? And just as importantly, why does it matter? And so we're thrilled to be joined today by three excellent guests who each bring a particular expertise to this subject. Ryan Burge is an assistant professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University. His research focuses largely on the intersection between religiosity and political behavior, especially in the American context. His work has been published in a wide variety of peer-reviewed journals and has been covered by the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, Vox, Christianity Today, and Religion News Service, among others. He's also the author of two recent books, one on the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, as I'm sure he'll clarify a few times, and another on prevailing myths about religion and politics in the United States. Kelsey Dallas covers religion, sports, newly sports, and the Supreme Court for the Deseret News. She holds a master's degree in religion from Yale Divinity School. She grew up in Illinois, loves listening to podcasts and talking about her two dogs. She also publishes something really cool, a newsletter called State of Faith. Is that the right name? Good. Through Deseret News, which you can subscribe to now. It's a good rundown on what's happening with regards to religion and politics and law in the US, plus some fun tidbits in there. Last but not least, Jacob Wolf is an assistant professor of government at Regent University. He was previously the John and Daria Berry postdoctoral research fellow in the James Madison program at Princeton University. His research pertains generally to understanding how cultural and political presuppositions affect the practice of religion in America. Jacob has also served as the communications officer for Christians in Political Science for the last year. And starting in a few weeks, we'll be transitioning to a new role of vice president at Christians in Political Science. So as for today, we'll be speaking, we'll begin with each speaker taking a few minutes to give their general answer to the question, what's up with American religion? Then I'll moderate some back and forth between them before finally taking questions from you all. You can put your questions in the chat box or raise your virtual hand when that time comes. And without further ado, let's kick things off with Ryan Burge.
Thanks, Dan. I need to share screen. Hold on. Okay, here we go. Act like I haven't done this before. Okay, share. All right, everyone. Welcome to the show. The big news, here's a little sneak peek, big news for you. The Nun second edition is coming out in May of 2023. There's the cover right there. I just got it last week. It's going to have about 50% more content. I think I'm at 70 graphs now in the second edition. It's a heftier volume, 160 pages in the first volume, almost 250 in the second volume. And the new volume is going to have an entire chapter based on COVID-19 and what COVID-19 did to American religion. So just FYI, it'll be out in May of 23, and you can pre-order on Amazon right now. So there's my plug. My publisher can be happy I did that. Here's the graph that everyone sort of knows about American religion. I suppose at this point, this is the kind of graph that led to the nuns. A lot of things to unpack here. I'm going to kind of unpack a couple of those really quickly. First one is the share of people with no religion. In 1972, 5% of Americans had no religions, or at least that's what they said on surveys, which is 1 in 20 people. I was reading the proceedings of 1968 American Sociological Society meeting, and one of the sociologists there called the nuns in the neglected category in 1968, which is hilarious because they're still in some ways neglected. I think they're understudied in a lot of ways compared to other religious groups. But they only rose between 1972 and 1990, they only rose between 5% to 7%, which is actually statistically insignificant. So the share of Americans who were nuns is basically the same in 1990 as it was in 1972. But from that point forward, we see the sort of meteoric rise of the nuns, 12% by 1996, and then 16% by 2006, and then 20%, 24% in 2018. And now the current GSS puts the nuns at about 28%. I think that's an undercount still for a bunch of reasons. I think the right number is probably around low 30s. CES has it at 37. Pew has it at 30. Then Gallup has it at 21. So I think low 30s is probably the right answer. Probably 30% of Americans have no religious affiliation. This is the CES data, which is what I use all the time. Largely because it's just a huge sample and I can do all kinds of fun stuff with huge sample. You can't do it with a small sample. For instance, in the 2020 version of CES, there were 61,000 respondents. So that's about 20 times the size of the GSS. And so you can see now that the share of Americans who are atheist is 7% today. Share who are agnostic is 6%. But the share of nothing in particular are 24%. I'm sorry, 20, is it 24%? Yeah, my thing's in the way. 24% of Americans are nothing in particular now. That's actually what I want to focus on today is this yellow bar. The people who say they're nothing in particular. I think a lot of people, especially a lot of Christians, when they hear nuns, they automatically kind of drift towards atheist agnostic because of what happens in evangelical churches. We talk about how atheists are like, I don't want to use the word enemy, but the people we are opposed to, right? They are not what we are about, but they actually represent a pretty small sliver of American society. Nothing in particular. If you put 5 nuns in a room, one's an atheist, one's an agnostic, and 3 are nothing in particular. So most nuns are nothing in particular, and they are a lot different than our atheist agnostic friends. So this is where really the rubber meets the road on those things. This is the share of each tradition that have a bachelor's degree or more. 51% of atheists have a bachelor's degree. Only 45% of agnostics have a bachelor's degree. But then look way down here at the bottom. Only 25% of nothing in particulars have a 4-year college degree. Along with Black Protestants, they're the least educated religious group in America today. I mean, it kind of shows you just the tremendous divide educationally, which also leads to SES differences and all the kinds of outcomes that go along with educational differences. Nothing in particulars are on a different planet, SES-wise, compared to our atheist agnostic friends. And this is income. 60% of nothing in particulars make less than $50,000 a year. Okay. Which means that this is household income too, by the way, which is even worse. I mean, these are a huge chunk of these nothing in particulars are living in poverty compared to 40% of atheists and 45% of agnostics make less than $50,000 a year. And only 13% of nothing in particulars make more than $100K as a household. It's 29% of atheists and 21% of agnostics and 19% of the general public. So educationally, they're falling way, way behind. Income-wise, they're doing very poorly income-wise. And this is a graph from the new book, kind of trying to really emphasize the point of like how they're struggling. So this is the share of people who do not have a college degree and make less than $50,000 a year. Only 12% of atheists check both those boxes. Don't have a 4-year college degree and make less than $50,000 a year. Amongst agnostics, it's 16%. Amongst nothing in particulars, it's 32%. So a third of nothing in particulars, I would say, are at the bottom of the SES ladder. No college degree and make less than $50,000 a year. I think by any definition, that's struggling. Educationally, socially, economically, totally different group. And here's what's even kind of more, maddening as a political scientist is these people are also a lot less likely to engage in political stuff. Over the last year, did you attend a political meeting? 11% of atheists said yes. 5% in particular said yes. I mean, worked on a campaign, 9% versus 4%. And here's a wild statistic, guys. 50% of atheists gave money to a candidate or campaign in the last 12 months. That's the highest of any religious group in America today. Atheists, half of them gave money to a candidate or campaign. It's 22% of nothing in particulars, but obviously that's an SES thing too. But look at this, put up a yard sign, 27% of atheists versus 14% of nothing. So you can't even say SES has anything to do with it because the yard sign's free. It really takes nothing. So they're not even engaging in the political process. Low education, low income, and not engaged in the political process. So really struggling, economically, socially, and all those things. But here's what's noteworthy about nothing in particulars. They're not liberals, okay? When this is ideology, right? So moderates here, anything up this way is conservative. Anything down here is liberal. As you can see, atheists are liberal Democrats, right? That's what this quadrant is. Agnostics are, I call agnostics atheist light or diet atheists. It's like 10% less atheist, like their politics are. But look at nothing particulars, right? The entire sample's here. They're right here. So they're slightly to the right on ideology, but they're slightly to the left on partisanship. So they're like sort of slightly conservative, slightly Democrat, right? So they're in a different sort of quadrant of the political spectrum than we assume the nuns are in. And I think I love this graph because this to me is like, I love not only how people define themselves, but how they define other people. So the survey asked people, put yourself in ideological space between 1 being very liberal and 7 being very conservative and 4 being middle of the road. Then they ask you to put the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in that ideological space at the same time. So you can like see how they view the actors in American politics. And here's what's really interesting to me. These are atheists. In 2016, the average atheist saw themselves in the exact same spot as the Democratic Party, right? No difference between no daylight. But look what's happened over the last 5 years or so. The average atheist has gotten more liberal, while they see the Democratic Party actually kind of scooting very slowly towards the middle. They're the only religious group that is more liberal than the Democrats or more conservative than the Republicans. Even white evangelicals don't see themselves as more conservative than the Republicans. So atheists are about as liberal as you get in terms of a religious political group. And then agnostics, interestingly enough, they see the agnostics see the Democrats becoming more moderate and they see themselves becoming more liberal too. It's actually interesting because this is almost a mirror opposite of that. Atheists see the gap getting bigger. Agnostics see it getting smaller. They see themselves getting closer to the Democratic Party. And this is nothing in particular. Obviously, this graph looks a lot different. The average nothing in particular is drifting slowly to the left, very slightly left of center now. They see the Democrats maybe slightly more liberal, but they see the Republicans, moving a bit further to the right over the last 5 years. And this is just vote choice. I make this point to say like atheists are about as democratic, a big D Democratic as Black Protestants are now. 85% of atheists voted for Joe Biden in 2020. That's better than Obama did both times. Amongst agnostics, 78% voted for Biden in 2020, which is about in line with what Obama got in re-election. Here's something really interesting on nothing in particulars, right? Obama got 70% of that group in 2008. Then he only got 64% in 2012. But look what Hillary Clinton did in 2016. She only got 55% of this group. This gap was 31 points in 2012, and then it narrowed significantly to only 17 points in 2016. And why? Because a lot of them went to third parties. 7% of them went to third parties. And now Biden, if you look at 2020, Biden got back to where Obama was in 2012. And actually, I think one of the reasons that Biden did win is because he managed to kind of claw back that 8-point loss that Hillary Clinton had with that group of people. And as this group's growing, by the way, it becomes much more consequential electorally, and no one's talking about that. We always talk about Catholics and evangelicals and Black Protestants. We need to talk about nothing in particular because it's literally 25% of America is in this group now, and they're malleable. They're not stuck or like hinged to a political party like other groups are. So 2 more slides and I'll be done. This is what the Democratic coalition looked like in 2008, and this is what the Democratic coalition looks like now. Okay, so 57% of Democrats were Protestants or Catholics in 2008, and 15% were atheist agnostic, and 21% were nothing in particular. So 36% were nuns, and 57% were Christians. Okay, now in the more recent data, what we're seeing is the share who are Christians has now dropped to 47%. So Democratic Party is not majority Christian anymore. And then 45% are nuns. So 47 versus 45. I think by 2024 or definitely by 2028, the Democratic Party is going to be more nuns than Christians. And I think that's something we really have to think about from an electoral standpoint. What does that mean? And then here's the Republican Party. In 2008, 80% of the Republican Party were Protestants or Catholics, and now it's 73%. So a 7% drop for Republicans too. They're also, not having as many Christians. And then the share of nuns has risen to about 21% now in 2020, when it was only about 12% in 2008. So they're actually getting more nuns as well. But what's interesting is the atheist agnostic percentage has not gone up. It's the nothing in particulars that have nearly doubled over the last 12 years. So here's how I describe it to people. I think the Democratic Party has a problem because it's trying to make conservative Black Protestants happy, but also liberal atheists happy, Latino Catholics, agnostics, nothing in particulars, right? All these different disparate groups who do not have a central ideology they're kind of swirling around, right? So like that's why, issues like transgender, or the ability of let's say churches to fire someone who comes out as LGBTQ. Atheists love a bill that would protect the rights of LGBTQ people. Black Protestants and Muslims probably don't like that so much, right? So, you've got a real problem there in trying to keep that coalition together. And you're seeing Biden not talk about this for a very good reason, because he knows he can't keep everyone happy on these issues. The problem for the Republican Party is simply this: there are a lot less white Christians in America today than there were 15 or 20 years ago. And that percentage is going to continue to decline. So they've been really good at keeping that base, but that base is shrinking. So they need to figure out how to become more diverse in bringing in, let's say, some nothing in particular or some libertarian atheist agnostics. But how do you kowtow to Christian nationalism on one hand, but also try to reach out to non-religious people on the other hand? So I think that both parties have a serious problem in the religious changes in America. They're just completely different in how those problems are presenting themselves to both parties, and how they were, kind of change their coalition will have a huge impact on electoral politics in the next 10 or 20 years. So anyway, I will stop sharing now.
Well, thanks, Ryan. I think we solved the party's problems right there.
Well, let's go home, guys. Pack it up.
I think we did it. Good work, everybody. Let's turn to Kelsey Dallas for her thoughts on this question.
Thanks so much. I wish I could listen to Ryan talk about slides all day long, so it's sad to take over. But I want to say, when Dan asked what's going on with American religion, my mind turned to the religious freedom space that I write about quite a bit, and to the term misunderstanding sort of flashing in bright red letters in my brain. That I think in the religious freedom space and in the religious landscape more generally, you have a lot of people misunderstanding each other, misunderstanding each other's political positions, beliefs, relationship to church, and then of course relationship to religious freedom. So I'm going to talk about that more specifically with a recent news story that many of you probably saw if you're active on Twitter. So Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, fresh off of a very intense term where he penned the abortion decision overturning Roe v. Wade, spoke in Rome at Notre Dame's Religious Liberty Summit. And there were news articles right after the video of those remarks was posted online, talking most notably about his comments on that abortion ruling and sort of his jokes about other world leaders talking about it. But if you dug into the coverage a little deeper, you saw that there was also a lot of frustration about his remarks on the rise of non-religious Americans, the rise of the nuns, the way that secularization might affect the religious liberty landscape and put religious freedom rights at risk. One of his quotes was, "The problem that looms is not just indifference to religion, it's not just ignorance about religion, there's also growing hostility to religion." So he wasn't trying to walk through specific cases and saying, okay, this is where someone's misunderstanding about faith, or Obama underrating Catholic beliefs on birth control led to some sort of Supreme Court issue. He was almost acting as if people who are less engaged in church sort of turn and have a war path against religion and against religious freedom rights. And so, as you might guess, there was a lot of frustration with that. There were elected officials from the Democratic Party, there were legal writers saying that Alito was totally misunderstanding where most non-religious people come from, and even where atheists come from. That in a lot of these debates, they're concerned about a right like LGBTQ human rights protections. It's not that they're motivated by some total disgust or disregard for people of faith. It's just that they have these concerns for a different issue. And then as I listened to the speech, what struck me was that those people complaining about his speech also were engaged in some misunderstanding because they sort of were totally deleting the context for Alito's remarks and not grasping that he was speaking to a pretty conservative crowd. He was speaking at the end of a conference that was sort of rehearsing all of these problems in the religious liberty landscape today, including internationally, where people are still arrested or even killed because of their faith. And so for Alito, it was never going to be sort of a kumbaya moment, which said, hey, how can non-religious and religious, how can Democrats and Republicans come together around this issue? It was always going to be like, hey, I'm preaching to my people here, conservative legal scholars, folks that were excited about the abortion ruling, excited about the coach prayer ruling. And so that was where I initially landed, was, hey, I think that these folks that have written about his remarks in a critical way are just scoring easy points with sort of their own choir and saying, like, isn't Alito so ridiculous? Isn't Alito abusing his spot on the Supreme Court? But as I thought about it more, and as I wrote about it, and I sort of thought about where Alito went wrong, maybe if I had to dig into it, I think it's what I spoke to earlier, which is that when he describes the problem of rising religious nuns as a threat to religious freedom, he's totally disregarding the fact that a lot of these religious freedom cases where conservative Christians are on the hot seat, so to speak, come from a place where people are trying to protect other rights or other interpretations of religious freedom. So the school prayer case this year involving a football coach in Washington State, a lot of those people that were challenging the coach's actions were saying, we're trying to protect non-religious students. We're trying to protect Jewish students. We want to make sure that they're not pressured to take part in a Christian ritual. And so it wasn't anti-religious freedom, anti-Christianity. It was more like pro-pluralism, pro-Jewish students, pro-non-religious students. And I think that to a certain extent, that totally flies over Alito and some other conservative justices' heads. And so that's very significant when you think about all sorts of religious freedom cases that might come their way in the future. But that's also significant to the broader landscape, which is that when you ask people at the church I grew up in Central Illinois, what's going on with non-religious Americans, non-religious young people, I think their mind would also turn to a sort of hostility. It would be like, they don't understand the value of the church in the community. They don't understand what we're trying to do for them, what we could offer to them. And they're just out to get us in some way. And so there's not a lot of soul searching about how the church failed these Americans or how the church just lost touch with them. And it's sort of limiting the country's ability to move forward together and to say, okay, well, we do have this growing group of non-religious people or nothing in particulars. What can we do to sort of stay on the same terms with or speak the same language as them, even if they sort of are never going to come back to church? So I've been really appreciative of the work of people like Ryan, where if you've read his book on the nuns, he isn't just going over the data and saying, oh, this is the problem it may cause for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. He's actually trying to explain a lot of the frustration of the nuns or the concerns of the nuns in order to help people who are still very engaged in religious communities or in religious freedom advocacy, to help them understand where the nuns are coming from and what messages they might need to hear in order to be a little bit more supportive of religious institutions or a little bit more supportive of religious freedom initiatives, even if they aren't coming back into the fold. So something that I'm focused on is how to keep those conversations going. I suppose that's not really the role of a journalist, is to like have more kumbaya moments, but that's just a personal concern. And so in my articles, I try to explain people on both sides or across the spectrum in languages that people at other points on the spectrum might understand. And I think that that's what I would want to talk about if by some miracle I had a chance to sit down with Supreme Court Justice Alito, is sort of like, hey, just so you know, this is what it's like to be a non-religious person in America today. And these are some of the concerns that they're bringing to these Supreme Court cases. Because as it stands, I think that people on both sides, people in different congregations, are totally lacking the knowledge of where people on the other side really are. So that's what I wanted to say. Looking forward to the questions later.
All right, thank you, Kelsey. Last again, but not least, we'll have Jacob Wolf, and I'll follow up with a question or two and then turn it over to all of you all.
Thanks, Dan, for this opportunity. I'm going to cover some similar territory to Ryan, but he's clearly the expert, so I really tread lightly here and he can correct me. But I want to start as sort of with the backdrop of the secularization thesis. Pretty much everyone in social science is aware of this. It kind of undergirds a lot of social science. It's just the simple idea that as society progresses, science and rationality will replace religion. So, everyone has thought that this is the usual pattern that societies will follow. And everyone's wondered, why hasn't America followed this trend, right? Why do they remain so stubbornly religious? They said that up until the rise of the nuns, right? So then you get all these social scientists that see this group that bucks the trend, that no longer affiliates with a specific religious tradition or denomination, and says, secularism is still happening. Secularization is still happening. It just took a while. America had a religious heritage, but finally it's, cast that off, and we're seeing secularization proceed apace. Ryan, I don't know what your take is on this, but it seems like something more complicated than mere secularization is going on here. And in fact, in my own work, I try to suggest that something else is going on. And I've come up with sort of two frameworks for thinking about this. There's a principle of democratization going on in American religion, and there's a principle of individualism modifying the content of American religion. But I'll use the nuns as a way into this question. So there's a couple problems with understanding them as merely secular, as Ryan pointed out. One is they don't seem to really know what they believe or think. And you can see this through a feature called religious liminality. So if you ask them if they're affiliated, and you do so repeatedly, it turns out this group is not very stable. They might give one answer one year, a different answer another year, and then go back to it. So they might, for example, say, oh, I'm a nun. And then the next year when they ask the exact same question in the exact same manner, they might say, I'm committed to some tradition, or I'm a committed agnostic. And then the very next year, they might go back. So there's a lot of instability at the individual level. And so some political scientists, sociologists of religion have tried to figure out what's going on here. And it seems like only 30% of those, nothing in particular, are consistently irreligious people. You can find out interesting things about them if you actually ask their beliefs and their practices. And it turns out that a lot of them still believe in God. A lot of them feel the presence of God in their own lives, something like 4/5 of them. 3/5 actually believe in angels and say that they have experienced the presence of angels in their own lives. One thing that's kind of interesting is they're pretty low on the attendance. So only 1/3 attend religious services. But this could be, it's hard to figure out what the causation is here, because this could also be the fact that they skew young and they also skew unmarried. But I'll leave Ryan to tell me if that's true or not. Another thing that I think is important to understand in modern American religion is what I call the concomitant rise of non-denominational Protestants. So over the exact same time that the rise of the nuns have happened, there's been a rise in non-denominational Protestants. In fact, in 1990, there was only 195,000 non-denominational Protestants. Today, there's 12 million. So the political theorist in me, someone who's looking for big, broad-scale changes, is saying, wow, there's a similar hesitation towards affiliation amongst the supposedly least religious group of people in America and the most religious group in America. So what is it that could lead both types of people to not want to affiliate with a religious tradition specifically? So why are these people exiting churches? Toward the end of his life, I got to know Peter Burge, the famous sociologist of religion, who just go over to his house and chat about religion. And one of his things that he wanted to really impart to me was that this is not liberals leaving the church over mere conservative politics. he said just as many are people who leave sort of mainstream denominations because they are virtually secular in their programming. You know, it's more of a social club than a religion. So this is hard to tease out exactly what percentage it is, but it does seem to be some people who are disaffected from conservative churches, but also a lot of people who perceive their mainline church as being, you know, hardly religious at all. So much so that why do you even attend? You could just join a social club. So in my own work, which comes from a political theory background, I try to understand what's going on. And I look back to a tradition in French political thought started by Benjamin Constant and used by Alexis de Tocqueville, where they used a distinction between religious substance or religious sentiment and religious forms. So there's a difference between the actual subjective feeling of religion or of the supernatural and the forms that religious practice takes. And the form could be dogmas, practices, traditions, hierarchies, the structures of the religion, all those things we associate with more formal elements, right? So Tocqueville, in his book, Democracy in America, basically says that American democracy has taught Americans to disregard and to disdain forms. He says they stand in the way of what they want to achieve. I might read a couple quotes here from Tocqueville because I think they're really poignant. He says that American democracy is built on a hatred of forms and formalities. He says, since they're accustomed to relying on their own witness, they love to see the matter they're dealing with very clearly. So in order to see it more closely and in its full light, they rid it as fully as they can of its wrapping. They push aside all that separates it. They clear away everything that hides it from their view. The disposition of their minds soon leads them to scorn forms which they consider as useless and inconvenient veils placed between them and the truth. Oh, one more specifically about religion. Nothing revolts the human mind more in times of equality than the idea of submitting to forms. Men who live during these times endure representations impatiently. Symbols seem to them puerile artifices that you use to veil or keep their eyes from truth, that it will be more natural to show them entirely naked and in the full light of day. The trappings of ceremonies leave them cold, and they are naturally led to attach only a secondary importance to the details and practices of worship. So what I think Tocqueville's saying about American religion, and obviously this is some time ago, but I think it has lasting effects, is that Americans prefer a more individualistic type religion. They're hesitant to participate in religious institutions. They're hesitant to link up with a tradition outside of themselves. They want to light on those dogmas or beliefs which affirm the self because they're individualistic by nature. So they have a hard time with forms of religion. And you can see this in a lot of different denominations. So I think we're seeing not a breakdown of religion itself, but religious forms or formal religion. So a lot of these nuns that you're talking about would call themselves religious, but the religion they practice is something that they determine. It's a sort of picking and choosing of the beliefs and practices which they find fulfilling. And it's very rarely set in a specific church institution. It's very rarely attached to a specific tradition. It's kind of buffet style religion, right? So that's one of the things I think is going on. But I'll dive just a little bit more deeply into this topic of individualism, because I think this is the thing to look for in American religion. I think there's quantitative effects of individualism in America so that you can see people withdraw from both church membership and church participation. Individualism basically says that people are going to withdraw from communal participation in various things in favor of individual or isolated practice. So I think you can see this in church membership levels, which were about 65% of the population in the 1960s and have dropped to about 35% today. Similarly, church participation has fallen. So not just membership, but whether or not you go to church has fallen. It was at about 45% in 1965, and it's just under about a third of Americans attend church regularly, which is defined as weekly or almost weekly. The nuns, interestingly enough, seem to come from the group of people who attended church on Christmas and Easter. The people who attend very rarely, but maybe once or twice a year, they seem to have left even those services, so that they're just functionally non-church participants now. But I think more subtle and perhaps more important are qualitative changes that are happening. So not only does individualism cause people to leave religious institutions, it causes them to change the structure, the form, the practices within religious institutions. So Robert Wuthnow is really good on this. He basically says that American individualism causes us to favor what he calls loose connections to institutions. That is, we favor narrowly tailored, convenient, short-term relationships with our institutions, with our churches. In short, Americans just don't like being tied down. So this has caused a shift in the religious institutions themselves such that they've become porous. They have lower barriers to entry. We've reduced the cost to exit. We've flattened hierarchical structures, basically in a way to try to appeal to these individualistic persons who prefer to have convenient connections to institutions. And I see this reflected in the rise of mega churches, right? It's easy to enter and exit this organization. It's a religion that appeals to people who are somewhat wary about it. You can participate as much as you want or as little as you want. You can go there to meet people, you can be totally isolated, you can be anonymous, and it sort of facilitates that. The other thing that I think is important to look at is individualism invites individual or personal choice and preferences into the structure of the institution. Francis Fukuyama called this phenomenon the miniaturization of community, that rather than being one big community focused on, standard Christian goals and ends, we break down into smaller contingents of people who look just like ourselves and believe the same things as ourselves, and are not really community in the broad sense of cross-cutting pressures of different types of people from different, SES, from different races and so on. We subdivide into groups that look like us. And so I see this reflected in the rise of small groups in American churches. Like, your way of entering a church is usually mediated through some interest that you have, that could be Bible study or something, more substantive, but it could be rollerblading, right? We open up the space to individual preferences as a way of getting into the institution. So I think these two themes, which maybe we can talk about a little more in the questions of democracy breaking down formal religion and individualism changing the type of institution we go to, if we go to a religious institution at all. We can maybe flesh that out a little bit more in the comments and questions. So thanks.
Well, thank you, Jacob. There's a lot to chew on between Ryan, Kelsey, and Jacob's comments. So rather than me trying to ask some questions at the front, I want to make sure we get as much from you all as you want. I think I'll ask the speakers if they had any reactions to one another's comments or similarities, jumping off points, things of that nature. If you do have a question, you can put it in the chat. Also, just raise your hand virtually, and I can keep track of that, and we'll go from there. So speakers, any initial reactions to one another?
I was just going to say, I was sort of chuckling to myself during Jacob's presentation about the part about individualism in particular, because after having my son, who is now almost 2, my husband and I decided to get more invested in a local church, but I still find myself, when the service ends and coffee hour is starting, just rushing out the door, grab my purse, grab my toddler's stuff, get out of there before I'm forced to make friends. And I don't know where that comes from. And I always sort of think to myself later in the afternoon, why do I see it as such a problem to make small talk with these people that I want to be in relationship with? And so I was just laughing, thinking about how that individualistic streak, that desire to be anonymous, comes for all of us, even those who are interested in building community.
Yeah.
I go ahead, Ryan, please.
Yeah, I was thinking about, Kelsey talking about religious freedom, and I think Kelsey's the best journalist talking about religious freedom right now, FYI. So she understands it way better than I do. But what's so interesting to me is there's a growing contingent of Americans who think religion is bad, like fundamentally bad for American society, American democracy. It's punishment. It's bad. It's just a net negative. And on this, in the same hand, there's a lot more nothing particulars who are sort of meh about the whole religion thing, right? I think what we're going to see is a louder and louder conflict between, conservative religious people on one side who say religion is an absolute good and we should impose it upon other people, and then a lot of growing number of atheist agnostics who, by the way, are small in number but loud in the discourse. I think that's one thing the atheists really do well is they outsize their numbers in the American discourse, but they think that, religion should have no protections at all in American life. And I think those conflicts are only going to get larger and louder, especially on, Twitter's not real life, but you see it all the time. Like, Emma Green wrote a piece about, pro-life people going into OBGYNs, wanting to become doctors. And you should have seen the comments were like, I don't think if you're pro-life, you should be a dermatologist. Like there was just this absolute intolerance of any other viewpoint than their own. And I think that kind of rhetoric is going to get worse and worse as the nuns become emboldened on one side and conservative Christians push back on the other side. And a lot of Americans are sort of like, I want to defer to religion sometimes, but not all the time. And how we work out when you defer and when you don't is really the future of religious liberty in this country. And I think that's one of the most important, aspects of American society going forward is how much leeway do we give religious groups and how much do we not? And I think there's no easy answer to that question.
One thing to add, I talked about this quite a bit with folks after the abortion ruling, that what I was struck by was a lot of the frustration being shared on social media by those who support abortion rights, who supported Roe v. Wade, was that people in the pro-life movement are actually just out to get women or who are just out to support the GOP at any cost. There was really very little talk about they have a religious belief that life begins at conception, or, this is a very personally significant issue for them. And abortion really does feel like murder in some sense. And there were a lot of people who just were totally discounting that potential religious motivation for the pro-life movement.
Interesting. David Innes has a question to Jacob, but also potentially to each of you here. I like the way this is structured. Yes, Tocqueville's insights. Okay, great. 200 years ago. But why are we seeing this sharp rise now? So maybe that's a question for Jacob, maybe for Ryan. Do you buy the premise that we're seeing this sharp rise now, or is it something that we've been seeing for a while? Kelsey, any thoughts on the legal side of things? Take it away.
Want me to start?
I'll let you start, Jacob. Absolutely.
All right. Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question because it was the question that kept me up at nights as I was writing my dissertation and caused me to write a subsequent book and manuscript. So I wrote about 200 pages answering this exact question. And my answer to the question is that individualism itself has changed over time from what you could call Protestant individualism, classic individualism, utilitarian individualism. Those are words that have been thrown around in the literature, to what is now called expressive individualism. So the changing sense of self in America is why this is happening now. And I see that the understanding of the self, the anthropology that we have today, is fundamentally different than Tocqueville's time. And essentially, the premise of expressive individualism, how it's different from earlier versions, is that early versions would see human beings as somewhat flawed and in need of refinement through moral rules, institutions, social constraints, so on. Expressive individualism inverts that anthropology and suggests that human beings are innately good. This comes out of Rousseau for a reason, that they're innately good, and it's actually those moral rules, institutional constraints, societal structures that make people evil. So the corollary of expressive individualism, which is I think, a burgeoning sense of self in America right now, is that we need to be freed from all these things in order to be authentic. You can see this happening in pretty much every denomination across the board nowadays, that authentic faith requires breaking from all those things, from tradition, from church hierarchies, and so on. So my sort of long answer to your question is that individualism itself has changed over time, that our understanding of the human person, our anthropology, has become inverted. And that's a long, complicated story that I try to sketch out in my book, starting with the Puritans and Ben Franklin, Walt Whitman, Emerson, some later thinkers in the 20th century. But it's this attempt to invert the classic understanding of human beings, which is that they're in need of constraints in order to have their full human flourishing. And now we think that it's precisely liberation from those constraints that brings us, human flourishing and authenticity. And I think that's finally seeped into American religion.
Ryan or Kelsey?
I wrote about this for RNS. I think the 1990s were like the key moment in American religion. Going from 5% to 7% between 1972 and 1990 is nothing. And then we go from there to boom, where we are today. I point to a couple of things. The fall of the Soviet Union, right? Because now it used to be American was to be Christian, to be communist was to be godless. And we take that enemy away. And now you can be godless and not be communist. So that's a good thing. We can't discount the fact that, that's when then the era of bomb throwing politicians really showed up, right? Newt Gingrich's, the Tom DeLay's, I think we're kind of living in the like those guys basically said, it's okay to make the other party look like they're terrible people. It used to be that we got along and it was fine. And now we're not living in that era. And then you kind of have to throw the internet on top of all that, right? I mean, we can't measure that quantitatively, or, causality is really tough there, but now you can go online and find out atheism Mississippi, am I alone? No, you're not. There's a whole group. You can go find them and hang out with them. And now you can say I'm an atheist in Mississippi, when 50 years ago, you say atheist in Mississippi, they say, get out, leave the house. So I think it's just, I actually think in some ways we're actually kind of revealing what we've always been, which is a lot less religious than we thought we were. And now we're just getting closer to the real answer on surveys. And I think we're really living in the residue of what happened in the 90s when people started coming out. We're seeing the same thing with LGBTQ, right? Acceptance on that rapidly changed because more and more people came out, which gave more and more people permission to come out, which led to acceptance of other people of that approach, right? I think the same thing's happening with nuns. As more came out, it became more socially acceptable to say you were a nun. And then other people were like, yeah, you can have no religion. It's not like, the kiss of death like it used to be, politically and socially. So I think we're getting to the point where it's slowing down now. I actually think if you look at the data, we're not getting much above 40 or 45%, but I think we're getting closer to where we really have always been. So
I'll just say this might take the question in a weird place, but what I was thinking about is why in this moment do we suddenly have all of these really high profile religious freedom cases involving conservative Christians? Like, why every single year does there seem to be even more? And I think there's two answers to that. One, the makeup of the Supreme Court. So Christian conservative legal organizations know that this will be a friendly, sort of receptive court to a number of these complaints. But then the other thing is, and this is one I heard from a legal scholar named Doug Laycock, is that because of the rise of the nuns, the rise of the non-religious, America becoming more religiously diverse, there really are more conflicts involving Christians not getting their way than there were in the past. Like, you don't have quite as many lawmakers on speed dial who can smooth a path for you when a policy is causing trouble. And so it makes sense that there would be more legal conflict involving conservative Christians, just because there's not as many conservative Christians in places of political power.
That's a great point, Kelsey. Okay, we have a question from a self-described outsider from South Africa. I'd like to know from speakers whether they would agree that the politicization of the church in America is at least partly responsible for these shifts that we've been seeing in religion. He quoted T.D. Jakes saying a few years ago that the American church had prostituted itself. to politics. Didn't know if you had any comments on that. And apparently John actually followed up with onto that question. What do you guys make of the religious backlash theory as an explanation of the nuns? And why didn't the rise of the moral majority trigger a rise in the nuns? Was the 90s Republican Revolution, like you were suggesting, Ryan, with Newt Gingrich, is that different somehow? A lot in there. So again, just take it as you will.
I mean, I think you cannot discount the impact that religion has had, or politics has had, on disaffiliation in America. I'm trying to find a graph. This is what I do. I'll show you a graph because that's what we do here. The share of Americans who are nuns based on political ideology, and this is this is from the GSS going back from 1972 to 2021. I mean, it's over 50% of liberals are now nuns. It's interesting to think back in the 1970s that people who were lean liberal, 10% were nuns compared to 5% of people who were conservative. So the difference was actually really, really small in the 1970s. And for conservatives, it's only gone from 5% to, about 12% now. For liberals, it's gone from about, 18% to 50%. So there's definitely a connection between politics and religion, especially amongst young people. You're seeing young Democrats. It's really, really, I don't think people fully appreciate this fact. And I'm trying to articulate this in a book level project, that there used to be space in American society, especially for white liberal Christians. There are very few spaces in American life for white liberal Christians anymore. The main line, which is the tradition that I'm a part of, I mean, they're dying rapidly. It's hard to overemphasize how few mainline Protestants, according to some measures, half of America were mainline Protestant in the 1950s, and now it's 10% of America. And most mainline Protestant traditions are going to be dead in the next 20 or 30 years, or very much, a shadow of what they were even today. In my county of 40,000 people, there are 4 mainline churches, and I think there's a very good chance in 10 years there'll be 1 mainline church. So there's not a place for to be a liberal white Christian in America anymore. So to be white and to be liberal is to be a nun. And I think that's driving a divide as well. At the same time, the share of Southern Baptists who are conservative has risen from 45% to 75% during the same time period. So, you're seeing like to be evangelical is to become even more conservative, and to be a nun is to be even more liberal. And I think we talk about political polarization a lot. We don't talk about religious polarization enough, because religious polarization is very real. And I think it's actually accelerating and is exacerbating the political polarization in America, because in the late 1980s, 45% of white weekly churchgoers were Democrats and 45% were Republicans. And now it's 75% and about 15%. So we have monoculture now in most evangelical churches when we didn't 30 years ago. And I think that's really making things worse, because now we create the worst version of the other party in our minds and then hate that version of it, not realizing there are real people across the aisle who have real thoughts and fears and dreams and hopes. They're not very dissimilar from us. We just don't see them anymore because we don't sit next to them on the pew on Sunday morning. We just see them on social media saying dumb things that we can laugh at. So.
We have a couple more questions here, so let me actually pivot a little bit here. Quick question from Nap Nasworth: is Ryan's time frame with the 90s, with Gingrich, the internet, is that what you had in mind with the start, or I guess the rise of this expressive individualism, or was it concurrent? What's going on with that time frame?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously an older philosophy, but it takes a while for it to really hit the mainstream. And I think really the advent of the internet, and in particular social media, I see, Twitter, Instagram, especially now TikTok, is just basically expressive individualism institutions, right? It's a way to showcase the self, to find other people who think just like you. And it also, really interestingly, brings about the exact same thing that Ryan was talking about, is sort of you very easily hate the other side once you've found your small little group of people who think just like you and have the same interests and preferences. So I think it's an older phenomenon that really, with the infusion of the internet and social media in particular, becomes something really tangible and something that just spreads like wildfire through culture. But I don't think it's caused by that. I think the sort of presuppositions have been building for a long time. And now we had the institutional framework for that to hit a large swath of the population.
Great. Okay, quick measurement question for Ryan is a softball. Wouldn't it be more helpful when judging religiosity to more clearly separate atheists, agnostics, and unaffiliated believers in surveys.
I would love that, except the GSS asked the same questions in the same way that they did in 1972, and they ain't changing. For good reason, right? I do think there's actually a lot of value in measuring things the same way, but then they went online in 2021 and everything got screwed up bad. If you want to see some real tragic data, the share of Americans who are Protestants dropped 10% between 2018 and 2021 compared in the GSS, which is just not going to happen. It doesn't work that way. So when you change one thing in the GSS, things go sideways, and it basically ruins the best tool we have for longitudinal data. So I like the fact that CES and Pew have these 3 options for nuns, and I like the fact that GSS has the 1 option for nuns. Although I do think the GSS undercounts, I want them to continue to do it the same way, so I have a baseline barometer to compare to every year or two, and I want these other surveys then to give me more nuance on the other side. So that's the long and short of that.
Good question. Anthony, I see your question. I think that's really a good one to kind of close with. I want to get to Robert's question here. In my Twitter feed, I see a considerable amount of angst regarding white nationalism, framing it in 2 ways. First, it's framed as capturing white evangelicalism. And second, it's framed as a real threat to democracy. Speakers, I wonder if you want to address those frames.
I'll talk about Christian nationalism, I guess. I mean, I think it's become, it's taken on a life of its own. Let's say that. I think it's become a lot bigger. There's a lot more discussion in the popular culture than there is actual good scientific work about this. I mean, to be fair, Sam Perry and crew have published 30 different papers on Christian nationalism, which is great. But I think the measurement that underlies their scale is actually suspect, as according to a new paper that Nick Davis just published in Politics and Religion. The questions we ask to get to Christian nationalism, I don't think are that good. I think it's a real thing, but I think from a measurement standpoint, I don't think it's as good as we think it is. And I don't think, and this is the problem I think that they're struggling with, as all social science struggles with, me included. How do you measure stuff? How do you define Christian nationalism? And there's really blurry lines there that I think are really difficult to answer. For instance, if I favor prayer in public school, does that make me a Christian nationalist? 75% of Americans are in favor of prayer in public school. Like, you can't say 75% of Americans are Christian nationalists, right? So I think we're really struggling from a measurement standpoint. I think we all recognize there is this thing going on in American culture. I just don't think the science is as good as we need it to be right now. And I think we're getting there, but this is how everything works in social science. Cool concept comes out, bunch of stuff published, everyone thinks it's the greatest thing in the world. And then a bunch of people come out and try to criticize it, and it kind of gets taken down. And then it comes back up as we realize what it's good at and what it's not good at. Right. So I think we're still in the it's great mode, but we're starting to go into, wow, there's a lot of problems with this mode. And I think that's just a natural thing you do in social science when a new concept comes around like this.
Well, and if I remember correctly, that first that first big Christian nationalism article from Perry and Whitehead was like 2018 it was 2018 with Sociology of Religion. So I mean, it's just 4 years old that we've really seen a lot of this stuff hit the mainstream, and there's room to work with it, basically.
Yep, we're not there yet.
I was going to add really quick, speaking as a journalist, I've really been wrestling with nationalism in general, and Christian nationalism specifically, where I actually think we'd be better off if journalists wrote around the term by talking specifically about what type of behaviors it's referencing or what type of beliefs it's referencing, because it feels like the phrase has gotten away from us, that like Marjorie Taylor Greene is like proud of it. Like there's no frustration with being called a Christian nationalist. So anyway, that I just, in my editing work here at the Deseret News, I often will cut out Christian nationalism in order to replace it with something that might help move the conversation along a little better.
I'll just add that Mark David Hall has a recent piece basically saying all of this, that the term means everything and nothing, and it's been kind of used as a bogeyman, but he really dissects it very well in his piece. I think it's for the Standing for Freedom Center or something like that recently. But he really digs into the literature and says, here's what we should worry about, and this is sort of stuff that's invented by lack of definitional clarity. So I would just recommend that to you.
I just dropped it in chat.
Thank you.
tilting at windmills is what it's called.
Yeah, exactly.
And Knapp acknowledged or reminded us that American Values Coalition had a webinar with Sam Perry, and he did acknowledge there are some measurement issues. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a lot to try to tackle here. One question before we get to Anthony's, and then I think we're gonna have to wrap things up here. Has subjective truth, right, my truth versus your truth, had any effect on the polarization of the church? If so, and the church, I think just we could expand that to, institutionalized religion. If so, how?
It's been a mind trip. I think Dan can echo me on this. Growing up in an evangelical household and the nice, to being told that, absolute truth is the most important thing in the world. And then we're told that you can vote for Trump because he's a Republican, although he's a moral disaster. It's been very hard to like square the circle. And I think a lot of people, we're actually seeing our generation, like people born in like the 80s and early 90s, really being disillusioned by this whole thing, especially those who grew up. The evangelical movement is fueled by people in that box right there. Although let's not overemphasize, about 4% of Americans are evangelicals, by the way. So let's not conflate those with as bigger than they are. They're very loud on social as well. And I think a lot of people have had kind of dipped their toe in deconstruction because of this idea of subjective truth and absolute truth, and how they kind of just objective truth goes away when politics gets involved somehow. And I think that's really difficult for people to square that. And yeah.
Great.
Yeah. I'll just add that my hypothesis, which I'm working on proving with a colleague here, is that there's a deeper sort of sorting going on here than sort of political polarization or religious polarization. It's a sorting at the level of anthropology or philosophical presupposition. And it relates to this expressive individualism, which I already mentioned, that there's two fundamentally irreconcilable understandings of the self. One that sees institutions, rules, constraints, community as important to human flourishing, and one that sees those as the antithesis of human flourishing. So one seeks to put you in those institutions to be within those moral rules, and the other one says, run as fast as you can from all of those things, and then you'll be happy. And I think that's the deeper sort that's going on now. So whatever your understanding of the human individual is, you'll line up with a certain political party and a certain type of church. But this is all sort of happening in the as I speak, and so we can't see exactly where it's headed, but I suspect that's what's going on. Is there's two competing understandings of the human being, the human self, that are working themselves into different groups. And I don't know if that's a comfort to say it's not just politics or partisanship, or if it's something far worse, that there's an even deeper divide. I don't know yet what that means, but I'm working on teasing out how many people are expressive individualists versus traditionalists, and how those line up with the different parties. But it does seem like this is a growing divide in America, and I'll leave it at that. And when I get more grounding for that hypothesis, I'll send stuff around to CPS.
Speaking of measurement issues, but I think we'll have to tackle that later. Okay, last question. I really like this question from Anthony. So we can close with this. What do you all think is replacing religion, or could potentially replace religion as the social and institutional glue in America to counter social atomization? You can't say college football because conferences don't matter anymore, so that's gone. But what is it?
I think there's two answers, and one is worse than the other, and I'll let you figure out which one is worse. One is nothing, right? Mm-hmm. Literally nothing. Like we are just less social now than we've ever been in like really the history of civilization. Think about that for a second. I think it's true. We're less social now than at any point in the history of civilization, A. And B, it's politics. And politics has become, and actually we know this now empirically, the literature used to be, we always thought religion was the first cause and politics was downstream of religion. Like that's the way I was taught to think about religion. It's the independent variable and politics is the dependent variable. Now it's the opposite. Politics is the independent variable and it acts on religion. We choose what church we go to based on our own political persuasion. And that might have been happening a long time ago. We just haven't seen it. But now with great work by Jupe and Friends and from Politics Fused by Michelle Margolis and many others, we're starting to see that religion is actually downstream of politics now. And so partisanship, which leads to tribalism, because in America we only have two choices, which leads to the worst kind of tribalism there is. I think it's either nothing or politics. And I think both are really, really bad.
What popped into my head was pop culture, because during the pandemic in particular, it would be like appointment viewing when a new show came out, and people talking about it, listening to podcasts about it. But the problem is that that's not actually glue. So like, you're not checking in with the people that you listen to a podcast from about The Bachelor. You're not like checking in with them about how your mom who's undergoing cancer treatments is doing. So like, they might be your friend to talk about The Bachelor, but they're not your friend in life in general. And so that's why I think most roads that I come up with do lead to nothing, which is what Ryan just said, that you have things that fill your time. You have connections that sort of help you get a taste of good small talk or a laugh, but you don't really have this same sort of support system gluing the community together.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just echo what was said, but I think interest groups are replacing actual community, which is worrisome because it's self-selecting people just like you with the same interests. If you want to define community as that thing which takes in people who are different from you, who will challenge you, who will cause you to grow, I just don't see any of that anywhere anymore. You link up with people who are like you. You very rarely in contemporary American society have institutions which puts you next to people who are different from you. We tend to run from those institutions actually because it's uncomfortable to navigate difference. So I say it's nothing, and if it's something, it's maybe narrow interest groups, whether political or just trivial and fun.
Well, on that uplifting note, thank you all for coming. I know this is a really interesting conversation. You can follow each of these folks' spaces for their work on these things. Like I said, Kelsey writes a lot about these issues. Ryan's producing myriad graphs and visuals, and we'll look for his books, put that in the thread. And Jacob will be lurking and sharing some more stuff soon, I imagine. Thank you all for attending. For those of you political science folks, we'll be at the APSA meeting in Montreal. We'll have a business meeting there. Feel free to check that up in the program. Thank you all very much. Have a great rest of your day, and academics semester's right around the corner. Get to work.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.